Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is planning and configuring your chart of accounts. This is part 3, account structures and advanced rules description. My name is Erin, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you are agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions during and at the end of the presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Proffitt, Senior Program Manager, and Eric Peggers, Senior Program Manager. Rachel, over to you to kick us off today.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm super excited for part 3 of our series where we're going to really dive into the account structures and advanced rules. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Rachel Proffitt. I am a fast track solution architect based out of the Denver, Colorado area. My contact information is here on the screen. I do invite you to connect with me on Twitter, follow me on LinkedIn, check out my blog at dynamics365lady.com. And I also do have a new YouTube channel. It's Dynamics 365 Unboxed. I invite you to go check that out over on YouTube. Also joining us today is Eric Peggers. Eric, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. My name is Eric Peggers. I'm a senior fast track solution architect based out of Fargo, and my contact info is on the screen.
Great. Thanks, Eric. So quick review of our objectives for today's Tech Talk. We're going to discuss the components of account structures and review all the required setup that you'll need to create your own account structures. We're also going to review scenarios and examples of advanced rules along with their required setup. I want to make sure that one of the things you take away from this are those recommended practices for configuring both your account structures and advanced rules. We're also going to be taking a look at how to use the organization hierarchy to create relationships in your account structure, which is just an alternative way to add those allowed combinations. Some things we won't be covering in today's session are main accounts and financial dimensions. Those were parts 1 and parts 2 of our Tech Talk series. If you missed out on those recordings will be available on the Tech Talk Dynamics community page. I encourage you to check those out. Also, we won't be covering the ledger and calendars, which will be covered in the next part of our Tech Talk series, which is part 4. Our series will be wrapping up with a bunch of patterns and anti-patterns around your chart of accounts from start to finish. So I do encourage you and invite you to get signed up for those if you are not already signed up. So I want to get started by taking a look at account structures. The account structure is a term that is used specifically in Dynamics 365 Finance to define the combinations of main accounts and financial dimension segments that will be allowed. You can think of this as a way to define the full account strings that will be used for posting transactions. Some important things to note about the structure are that you can, and you should, have multiple account structures for each legal entity. You can share the same account structure across many legal entities as well, and we do recommend that you share as much as possible and manage your exceptions through the advanced rules. However, it is important to note that you cannot overlap the main accounts or dimension combinations in the account structures within a given legal entity. Another way of thinking about this is that main account, let's say 100100 for your bank account, cannot exist in two different account structures, where one adds a department and another structure adds a department and a business unit. Your account structures are split up into columns and rows. Starting with the columns, a few things to note are that first, your main account is a required column in every account structure. However, the main account does not need to be the first column. By default, when you create a new account structure, the main account will be the first column, but you can move it by adding another segment or a dimension and moving that segment or dimension to the left of the main account. We do recommend that you put the main account as close to the left as possible in the account string for ease of use and data entry. You will add additional columns to the account structure for each financial dimension that you want to include with the main accounts in your account structure. These are oftentimes again referred to as segments. The sequence that the columns appear from left to right in the account structure will dictate the sequence that users will enter the dimensions when pressing Tab in the segmented entry control. The segmented entry control is a special type of field that appears in journal entries, for example, where you can enter the full account string for a particular transaction. Now, the rows in your account structure are used to define which dimensions are required and not required, as well as the combinations that are allowed. In most cases, the main account defines the context for the dimensions in the columns to the right. Another way to think about this is for a range of main accounts, let's say revenue accounts that start with a 4 must have a business unit. And when business unit 1 is used, only certain cost centers and departments can be used. But when the business unit is 2, a different set of cost centers and departments are allowed. So this slide can be used as a quick reference guide for you to indicate the symbols that can be used when you type directly into the cells for the rows of your account structure. If you need to enter multiple criteria, you can use a semicolon to separate each criteria. The hashtags or pound signs in the slide are replaced with your actual account numbers or dimension numbers. Keeping in mind that your account and dimensions can technically include letters, but we do typically recommend that you avoid the use of letters in your account numbers and dimension numbers. Each of the hashtags would be replaced with the actual length. So if you have a 2-digit financial dimension, you would use 2 numbers instead of 3 numbers. If your main accounts have 5 digits, you would use 5 digits. So I've used 3 pound signs or 3 hashtags on all of the examples here, but the length will depend on what you have configured in your data. As an alternative to typing directly into the cells of the rows inside of the account structure, you can use the Fast tab at the bottom of the screen to add criteria. And when you click to add new criteria, it will automatically add the semicolon and format the text in the cell for you automatically using the characters that you see here. But understanding these symbols can make reading the account structure easier without needing to click each one and read the details on the Fast tab on the bottom. It's important to note that any one given row and cell can only have 7 criteria. For this reason, we recommend trying to group your similar accounts and dimensions together so that you can use ranges rather than listing the specific values out one by one. If you need more than 7 criteria, you can achieve this by creating a new row. Now, when you're finished creating an account structure, you're going to need to go through a process of validating that account structure. And there are 2 ways to do this in the account structure form. First is to validate at the header level, which is the button that you'll find in the action pane at the top. And this button will validate the entire account structure. Alternatively, you can select a particular row and use the validate button on the FAST tab just above the grid, and that will validate only the selected row. It is critical to note that you will want to perform some additional manual validation on your account structure before you validate. And we strongly recommend making changes to your account structure in a testing environment and executing your critical business process test cases prior to making that change in a production environment. First, you will want to validate the values that you have typed into the cells make sense for the data that you have configured in your system. And it's important to note that the values you type into the cells do not have to be actual values that exist in your data. For this reason, we cannot perform a systematic validation. For example, let's say you have business units that are 3 digits long, starting with 100 and going up to 999. The system will allow you to type 1000 ... 1,999 or 9,999 into a cell. However, this would result in no values being allowed when you try to post transactions because none of your actual dimension values are that large. Using ranges is strongly recommended to avoid complex long-term maintenance, and we always suggest that you allow space for growth in the design of your accounts and dimensions. We recommend that you use the account structures allowed values data entity as a way to import and export your configuration. By exporting those values to Excel, for example, you can do additional validation and perform a VLOOKUP, for example, against your actual dimensions and account numbers. So now I'm going to show you how you can limit combinations in the account structure. So I've opened up the Configure Account Structure form, and I'm going to select the Manufacturing P&L. You can see that I have a variety of rows already, and I'm going to click the Add button to create a new row. I'll select the operator for is between and includes, and then I'll type in the value. In my example, again, I'm using 400,000 through 99999. Next, I'll click into the business unit cell after clicking Apply. So here you can see it defaults to star, and I can manually type in here that I want to allow blanks by typing quotation, quotation, and I want to allow all values by typing semicolon and then a star. In the department field, I am going to use an example here is greater than and includes. And for this example, I'm using value 035. You can see that the system automatically reformats that for me when I click Apply. For cost centers, I'm going to leave it as all values, but I will mark the blank values are allowed on the allowed value details tab, and you can see that it replaces that with the quotation semicolon star. You might have noticed while I was going through this demo that I was getting a variety of warnings and error messages about overlapping combinations. This is common when you're creating new rows because a new row by default will have stars, and if you already have other rows, then you are creating an overlap. This is why at the end I cleared out my warning or my error messages that I had, and then used that validate button to make sure that I have no overlapping combinations. And so after I was done putting all of my combinations into that account string, I was able to see those details. It's important to remember that when you're done making changes, and I don't do it in this demonstration, you will need to activate your account structure in order for those changes to take effect. So once you click activate, that will open a dialog, and you can select the criteria and then click activate again to actually perform the activation so that your changes will start taking effect. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Eric, who is going to talk to us a little bit more in detail about the organization hierarchy and how to use it with the account structures. Eric?
Thank you, Rachel. Now let's switch gears to talk about how you can use the organization hierarchy within the account structure. You can think of this as an alternative to creating many rows in your account structure to control the allowed combinations, or a way to supplement the rows and combinations. It is important to note that you can only use organization units in the hierarchy, and these organization units must be a financial dimension to link to the account structure. For example, if you create a financial dimension called business unit, but it is a custom dimension and not linked to the business units in the operating units, then the dimension cannot be used with this feature. Out of the box, you can use business units, departments, cost centers, and retail stores. You can extend the operating units to add more types if needed. When thinking about using the organization hierarchy with your account structure, you will select a relationship from party A to party B, where party A and party B are, for example, business units and departments. In this example, if you create a hierarchy where business units are on level 2 of your hierarchy, and below each business unit on level 3 are the departments, when we inherit this relationship, then only the combinations included in the hierarchy will be allowed. This means that the lookups and the validation for the account structure would only accept the business units and departments that you defined in that hierarchy. You have the ability to go up or down the hierarchy as well. In most cases, you go down the hierarchy, but using the same example going up the hierarchy, you could choose the relationship from party A to B, where A is the department and B is the business unit. With that hierarchy, we would only allow a single business unit for each department. You can inherit multiple relationships from multiple hierarchies in each account structure. This might be important if the same department can be used with multiple business units, if we go back to the original example. This is because any given organization hierarchy can only contain a specific operating unit once. In other words, in a single hierarchy, the department for IT cannot exist twice, once under Business Unit 1 and again under Business Unit 2. In this example, you can do one of two things. Create multiple hierarchies for each department, defining the allowed business units underneath, or create one hierarchy for each business unit, defining the departments that are allowed underneath. In some cases, if you build your hierarchy upside down, you can minimize the number of hierarchies needed, but your data and requirements should drive this decision and the number of hierarchies needed. One of the key advantages to using the organization hierarchy for the allowed combinations is that the organization hierarchy is date effective. So if you need to make a change to the combinations, you can make those changes effective on a future date. Another advantage to using the hierarchy is that these hierarchies can be used in other areas of your system and for reporting purposes. The hierarchy is also visual and can be easier to validate and configure than creating many rows in the account structure, making your long-term maintenance easier. Additionally, when there is a change to the organization hierarchy, there is no need to edit, validate, and then activate the account structure, which can be a time-consuming process that should typically be done during off hours. Here's some examples of organization hierarchy for account structure combinations. First example is that only certain cost centers can be used with each business unit. So you would build a hierarchy that has legal entity on level 1. Then you would add the business units to level 2 and the cost centers to level 3. And this would be a not an upside down hierarchy. This would be the normal way. An operating unit, the other example is an operating unit, which could be a cost center or a business unit, can only appear in an organization hierarchy once. Build one hierarchy for each business unit or each cost center. Add a single business unit or cost center at the top level, and then add the other cost centers or business units below the first business unit. Okay. This demonstration is on the organization hierarchies, how to configure one. So we're going to open up the organization hierarchy and we're going to click on new and we'll give it a name. And then we have to click save in order to use the visual designer. And in the first row, we're gonna click insert legal entity. This would be the top level. And we're going to choose the legal entity, in this case, USMF. Then you have to select that legal entity and choose insert cost center. And we're gonna choose the cost center East. We're gonna do select the legal entity and add 2 more cost centers, Central and West. So what you have selected determines what level they go into. So now we're going to select the cost center East and insert a retail channel. And in the East, we're going to have Atlanta. And then we're going to select the Central cost center and add Chicago to the Central. And then we're going to select the West cost center and insert San Francisco. Now, when we're done adding the nodes, we're going to publish the changes and we're going to pick a publish date. And you can see there that the date is in GMT or UTC, and it will be published on that date. And there's a little bit of a glitch in the system, like journals don't have UTC date, they have just time zone date. So sometimes the organization hierarchy will not be working, and it's because of that date difference, and it actually takes a day, or you can move it a day earlier so that the UTC and the time zone date do overlap, and then it will become active. That's the most a common issue that people have with an org hierarchy because of that glitch in those dates. Yeah, so back to, oh, I'm sorry, there's another one. This is for the configure the organization hierarchy relationships on the account structures. So we're going to open up the account structures and we're going to select our specific account structure that we want to edit. It's already been put into draft mode, and we're going to change or click on setup and the relationship. And then we're going to pick the org relationships that we just set up and mark include on all the ones that we want to include. You can also uncheck include to remove them from this interface. And when you've got all of them included that you want, then you would go back to the account structure and mark or click activate to complete the changes. And this is what we were talking about. If now you can change the org hierarchy without having to put the account structure in draft mode once it's activated. And next, Rachel is going to talk about advanced rules.
Thanks, Eric. So advanced rules are typically used to help you manage exceptions. So, for example, if a certain legal entity needs to behave different than the other legal entities, you can use an advanced rule to add an additional dimension to a small subset of main accounts. For example, let's say you have a small range of marketing expense accounts and want to track an additional marketing purpose on those 5 to 10 accounts. Advanced rules can also be used when you need an additional dimension when a certain combination is used. Using a similar example, let's say you have a range of expense accounts and a department dimension called marketing. In this case, you want to track an additional marketing purpose for the range of main accounts only when the department for marketing is selected. You'll also want to use advanced rules when a dimension value only applies to a small set of dimension combinations. So if that dimension combination only applies to a few accounts, instead of putting that combination in your account structure, you can put that combination in your advanced rule. So instead of adding lots and lots of rows to the account structure, you can manage those exceptions in the advanced rule, allowing you to use ranges in the account structure. And now our finance joke of the week, combos, the official snack food of advanced rules. If you're not familiar with combos, it's a snack food that we have here in the US. It's kind of like a pretzel that's like round and stuffed with different things in the middle. Our GIF here is highlighted with the honey sriracha flavor. It's pretty funny. If you like our finance joke of the week, please be sure to put your thumbs up, your emojis, use that Windows icon and the dot or the period on your keyboard to open up the little selection of all your emojis. Let us know if you liked our finance joke and if you want to see more of them in our upcoming Tech Talks. So, moving on, I want to talk about a couple examples of advanced rules. So in this first example, we are using a project dimension for a range of expense accounts. So you can see I've created an advanced rule. It is linked to the manufacturing P&L. The range of main accounts and the criteria that we've put in here is main account is between and includes 606,000 through 606,800. So any of those accounts can have this. And you can see on the bottom, we've added an advanced rule structure. And you can see the segments that are included in that are projects. So in this case, all we do is add an additional segment to whatever is in the standard P&L. The second example here is where we have sub-departments for certain departments. So in this case, again, I am using the manufacturing P&L. You'll notice the status is draft, so I haven't activated this yet. But in this case, my criteria is where the department is between and includes 032 through 034. So these three departments are my retail operations, service operations, and project operations departments. And in this case, I want to add a sub-department. So I've created an advanced rule structure called sub-departments. You'll notice that my segments are department and department underscore CN. So these are the two dimensions that are being used in it. I'm actually repeating a dimension that is in the account structure, which is allowed. And that way I'm allowed to put in the criteria. So I can say 032 can only have these sub-departments, 033 can only have these, and 034 can only have these other set of sub-departments. You can't see a screenshot of that here, but that's basically kind of what I've configured in this particular example. In the third example, we have a marketing purpose on a range of main accounts. So in this case, you can see again, I'm using the manufacturing P&L and I'm saying where the main account begins with 601. So any of my main accounts that begin with 601, this rule will apply to. And you can see that in my case, I'm just adding a marketing purpose. So the only segment in here is the purpose. If I wanted to make combinations of that marketing purpose with other dimensions, right, I would need that are in the account structure, I would need to add those segments in here. But in my case, I'm just allowing any value for my purpose. So that's the only segment I needed to add to the advanced rule. The last example that we have is using an advertising type for a marketing cost center. So in this case, I created again a new advanced rule called advertising type. I also created an advanced rule structure here called advertising type. You'll notice the segments are cost center and advertising type. In this case, I have filtered for a single main account and a cost center. So this additional dimension for advertising type will only be used when these two, this main account and this cost center are used. Then I will be prompted for an additional advertising type. Because I have included the cost center in the advanced rule structure, I can build out combinations to say this cost center only allows specific advertising types. Because I filtered this rule to only apply to 008, I probably didn't need to put cost center in here, but I just wanted to kind of show a variety of different examples of how you can configure this. So what we're going to do now is switch gears and I'll show you how this works. So I am going to go into the general ledger, and for this example, I'm going to actually create this cost center example. So I am going to select my manufacturing P&L. I'm already in draft mode, so I'm going to click on Advanced Rules. I'm going to click New to create a new advanced rule and give it a identification and a name. I'm using advertising type for both fields. And then I need to click on Add New Criteria. So this is where I'm going to filter on that 601-300. And then I'm going to filter on the cost center equal to 008, which is the marketing cost center. And now I need to create an advanced rule structure. So I do this by clicking on the advanced rule structure button, which brings me into the advanced rule structure page. And I need to click new here to create a new advanced rule structure. Again, I'm calling it advertising type. And then I add my segments. So I add the cost center as my first segment. And then I add a second segment for the advertising type. I could come in here and set up different allowed combinations if I want to allow blanks and so on. I can rearrange these. I can, all the same things you can do with the account structure, you can do in an advanced rule structure. It's important to note that you do need to go through that activation process and click on Activate in order to be able to select this back on your advanced rule. So now that I've created the advanced rule structure, I come back to the advanced rule and click on Add. I choose advertising type and click Add. And now I've linked this in. In order to actually start using this, I will need to go through the activation process. So I'll need to close down the advanced rule, and back on the account structure, I'll need to click on Activate. So once it goes through its validation, it'll open up that dialog. I'll click Activate, and it'll kick off that batch process in order to activate this new advanced rule. There's no limit to how many advanced rules that you can have, but we'll talk a little bit about some of those more recommended practices around your account structures and advanced rules towards the end of today's presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about differences that you'll find between advanced rules and account structures. So when you set up an advanced rule, you may notice that the screens are very similar and the behavior is very similar. Starting first with account structures. Your account structure must include the main account, while the main account is actually optional in an advanced rule. The account structure is also limited to 10 segments in addition to the main account. And your account structure should be used for most of your allowed combinations, and your advanced rules should be used for the exceptions. One thing that you can do in an advanced rule that you cannot do with an account structure is add conditions when the advanced rule should be used. Each advanced rule can have 11 segments, and there is no limit to the number of advanced rules that you can create for a range. However, it's impractical in most scenarios to have more than 6 financial dimensions on a single account string. You'll want to carefully evaluate the usability when you're adding more than 5 dimensions to any account combination. Both account structures and advanced rules support creating multiple records and sharing or using those records with one or more legal entities. And we'll be discussing and demonstrating that more in part 4 of our Tech Talk series when we take a look at the ledger. They are also both used to define the allowed combinations, and both must go through an activation process. We also support having a draft version of both an advanced rule and account structures. When you have a draft mode, like so if you've published it and you're going to make some more changes to it, the system will keep using the old version of that account structure and advanced rules until you activate the new version. If you start a draft and decide that you don't want to use those changes, there are buttons to revert that draft and go back to the previous version that is active. So now I want to talk a little bit about the differences between advanced rules and budget planning rules. The configuration process that you use for both of these is exactly the same. And we're not going into great detail in today's session, but we are planning to do some budgeting tech talks in the future where we'll dive into this a little bit more. But I wanted to make sure we kind of explained the difference here. So one thing that's important to note is that only one account structure can be selected for the budget control configuration. So when you're using the budget control configuration, you would typically probably choose the account structure that's used with your P&L. And if you have split up your P&L into multiple, you're going to select the one that has the most dimensions that you want to implement budget control by. So the list of main accounts in your account structure is not actually restricted in budget control. It's only used to figure out which dimensions should be used for your budget control. So when you're in the budget control configuration form, the dimensions that will show up that you can select and move from the available to the selected pane on that first tab of your configuration will include all of the dimensions from the account structure and any budget planning rules that are related to that account structure. So let's say you had a revenue account structure and that's what you chose. And your revenue account structure, for example, includes a business unit, an item group, and a cost center. But you also want to budget by a department and a marketing purpose. But those two dimensions are not in your revenue account structure. You would create a budget planning rule to define those additional dimensions. Another kind of good important thing to note about your budget planning rules is that if you do not include main accounts on the budget control configuration, there's a, you select main accounts. If you choose not to include main accounts, then you're going to manually select which main accounts to perform a budget check on. When you go to that main accounts tab in the budget control configuration page, again, you're not seeing the list of main accounts that are in your account structure. You're seeing all of the main accounts in the entire chart of accounts for the legal entity that you're in. So really the key to your budget planning rules is which budget control configuration, like which dimensions do you want to use with your budget control configuration. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric, who's going to walk us through the do's and don'ts for account structures and advanced rules. Eric?
Thank you, Rachel. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts for account structures and advanced rules. Do separate account structures for different sections of your chart. You don't want one big account structure. It's best to have a few, I would say, is the general guidance. Do create account structures for accounts that have similar rules and combinations. And this follows the first one, that there's usually some logical breakdown for accounts and that follow a similar pattern, and those are the ones that to include on the same account structures and advanced rules. Do minimize the number of dimensions in each account structure. Again, this is effect for usability and also just the complexity. So, keeping the number down as much as possible. Do manage exceptions with advanced rules. We had some great demos and content on how advanced rules are conditional and having them come in to for those exception cases, which will help keep the structures relatively simple. Do use ranges to define the applicability of advanced rules. And this goes back to something we talked about in the previous part of this series, where we said, to have a design for your chart of accounts and know what values are reserved, so to speak, for different dimensions and different purposes, and use ranges to implement those in your rules.
Yeah, I really like this one. I think I couldn't emphasize this enough. Like, I think a lot of people, and I see them like, they're implementing this new ERP system and they take their chart of accounts, whatever it is today, and they just kind of bring it over and plop it in. But there's a lot of opportunity if you put some thought into it to make it better and make your long-term maintenance easier. While it will add some work up front, right? Because if you make changes to your account numbers or your dimensions, something like that, you're going to have to go through some sort of mapping exercise to move and transfer your balances over, your beginning balances at the very beginning. But I think the effort of that is actually worth it up front because of the benefit that you're going to get downstream in your long-term maintenance of your account structure if you put some thought into reorganizing and renumbering and making ranges where it makes sense.
Rachel, I'm going to finish the don'ts, and then I'm going to ask you a question that we got in the panel since it's on this topic, and I'll have you answer it now since we're on the topic rather than going to the Q&A, but let me finish the don'ts.
Sure.
Don't use a single account structure across all main accounts, and don't create an advanced rule for each main account dimension combination. Again, you want to use some ranges and not have a lot of them. The question was, coming from AX 2012 that allows over 5,000 rows of account structure, how do we implement such while migrating to Dynamics 365 without having issues with overlapping account structures and following best practices? Are there articles, publications that could assist in such cases?
Great question. There's not, I'm not aware of any, documents or articles about this, but I think you make a really good point. And I did talk about this in yesterday's session as well. It's even worse when you come from AX 2009 if you were using the older dimension hierarchy functionality, and if you had upgraded, it actually creates like one advanced rule for every single dimension combination. Really, like, I think like the upgrade tools are really just trying to make like for like, and like the upgrade rules don't really follow our best practices. And so my best recommendation to you is to actually not upgrade your account structures in your chart and to actually re-implement them using the data entities, upload what you want and upload what makes sense for your organization. And the data entity that you use to do that, I don't recall the name of it, but I know I mentioned it like a couple slides ago. Eric, do you recall the name of that entity?
I'll get it. Yes.
Yeah. So, right, that's really what I would recommend is like, don't just accept what it does. Like, it's just making like for like, and that may not be what makes the most sense, and to make it the easiest for your long-term maintenance. And chances are too that if you've been on like, even if it's an older version of Dynamics for some time, chances are like your chart has kind of started to get a little bit Frankenstein. One of our recommendations, and we talked about this in part 1, is like make time once a year to actually go through and clean up your chart. Like, disable those unused accounts, make sure that you've got ranges. You might actually rename or repurpose an account. Just remember that like if you're renaming or repurposing an account, or you're splitting something out where everything was in one account and we're now going to split it out into 2 accounts, you're likely to have to make reclassifying entries to get your chart to balance correctly. And you're going to want to consider your reconciliation reports and what effect that has on your reconciliation reports. But I think my general advice that I would give to people is use your upgrade or use your new implementation of the chart of accounts as your opportunity to clean it up, de-Frankenstein, you know, your chart, and like all those kind of plug and plays that have happened over the years, to make it make sense for where your business is at today, and leaving that room for growth so that you've got ranges and you can add things in later on. You know, as a general rule, this is what I like to kind of tell people, and it's not a hard recommendation, so we didn't put them in here. But in terms of number of account structures, if you have 1 account structure, you have too few. If you have 10 or more account structures, you likely have too many. The sweet spot is probably around 4 to 5 account structures. At a minimum, 2 to 3. But obviously it depends on your chart and like your business and how many dimensions you have. If you're in a public sector industry and you've got 13 dimensions, it's probably going to be a little bit more complex. If you're a simple kind of retailer and you've got 3 dimensions, you might be able to get away with just 2, 1 for your balance sheet and 1 for your P&L. But it's not uncommon that I see when I look at logically, when I look at people's charts, that, you know, obviously the balance sheet is kind of its own thing and it's usually pretty simple. If you are using inter-unit accounting, you might have a dimension in there. I sometimes see people putting dimensions randomly in their account structure. They've got a few accounts that they want to track that dimension on. Use advanced rules, again, even on your balance sheet, to manage those exceptions, because most of the time you probably don't need that dimension across the board on your balance sheet. It's obviously quite dependent on like your organization, so I can't tell you for certain. But when I think about your P&L, you might actually split it out to like revenue, COGS, and expense and everything else. Revenue and COGS oftentimes go together and follow a lot of the same rules. So you might combine revenue and COGS together. All of your other kind of expense accounts, all of your 6s through 8s, for example, might get grouped together into one. If you have statistical accounts in your chart, then almost always I would say they're going to fall in, and they're probably like down in the 9s is usually what happens. Then create a separate account structure for those statistical accounts, because likely the statistical accounts don't have or need all of the dimensions and don't follow the same rules as the rest of the accounts. Even if they have all the same segments, you might be far more flexible on the combinations of dimensions in your statistical accounts than the rest of your chart. So that's kind of the advice from an account structure standpoint. When you're thinking about advanced rules, if you have, 10 to 20 of these advanced rules, likely you're good to go. If you start getting into the hundreds of advanced rules, then I would say pause, take a step back and see, is there another way that we can configure this to simplify it? When you start to make lots of account structures and lots of advanced rules, you will start to see performance degradation. So the more you can simplify it and the easier it is to configure, one, it's going to be easier for your users to understand and the usability will be improved. And I think you'll just find that it's easier. Oftentimes, one of the things that I recommend is, instead of allowing blanks where like an account doesn't need a dimension or doesn't have a dimension, those accounts oftentimes can go into their own account structure. Or we dynamically add the dimension depending on if it's the exception or if it's the rule. If it's the exception, manage it in an advanced rule. If it's generally across the board, then structure it in your account structure. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit more advice in terms of like how to decide. It's obviously not a one size fits all, and you have to understand your chart, your reporting requirements, and so on to kind of figure out what makes the most sense.
And those data entities that Rachel mentioned are aptly named account structure allowed values. And there's also one called advanced rule structure allowed values.
Thank you, Eric. Very helpful. So those are those two data entities that we recommend that you use to import those combinations and manage that rather than trying to manually set them up. So kind of wrapping up with our checklist and resources. Again, we do have the same checklist that we put together for the previous sessions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This will be available as a PDF with your particular implementation as, that guideline to help make sure you're remembering all the steps that you need to go through. And we've also got our link out to the general ledger docs and the finance learning catalog. So with that, we are going to open it up to questions. I don't know, Eric, too, if we've got any questions that we already answered that we want to kind of go back through with the larger group.
There was one question. It was about they had put legal entity at the big. I guess the first point of the question was that they did not have main account as the first column in their account structure, which is of course allowed. And they had legal entity in the first column, and it was legal entity was not working. And other than the obviously opening a support case, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, because my thought was that you really shouldn't need legal entity in the structure because most of the transactions are legal entity specific anyway. But if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, in my experience, I don't generally see legal entity in the account structure. It's not uncommon that people will add it in their consolidation company, but you don't actually need to put it in your account structure. So when you're configuring your consolidation, if you do have multiple legal entities, all of the transactions are being tagged to a legal entity anyways, right? And you can run a trial balance by legal entity. You can run any of your financial reported reports by legal entity and so on. So if legal entity is something that you want, then I think consider usability, because it doesn't auto-populate like based on the legal entity you're in. If you need it for your consolidated reporting, I would say just add it. Like there's a setting where you can select a dimension. You do need to have a legal entity dimension in order to be able to select that for your account structure. And in the drop-down box where you choose if it's the group, the dimension, there's 4 or 5 options in that drop-down box. That's where you would choose legal entity in the consolidation process. So, I mean, I think great if you are putting it in your actual companies, as a financial dimension, I would like to understand that scenario a little bit more, because it doesn't seem like it should be necessary. And I'd like to understand that business case.
Sure. The follow-up part of that is, if you don't use legal entity in the account structure, what do you use for business intelligence when you are looking at transaction level detail?
Data area ID.
Right, that should be available in all the transaction files.
Yeah, every transaction is striped with the data area ID, unless it's one of the handful of tables. And there are some master data tables that don't have a data area ID. Like products is a great example, but like a released product does. Workers don't have a legal entity on them. They are global, but their worker employment has a legal entity, and a worker could technically belong to more than one legal entity. So I think in general, it's the data area ID that you want to use from a reporting standpoint if you're using Power BI.
And it may be called ledger name in the general ledger tables, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, all those tables are striped with the legal entity. Okay.
Let's see. Let's see. Our customer during implementation decided to create and use new dimensions. For most, blank values are not allowed, and we created the account structure according to their requirements. Now our customer also wants to import historical transactions from last year without dimensions. These dimensions didn't exist. Is it possible to allow blank transactions? And I believe that you would have to open up the account structure to allow it and then close it back up is probably, but I'll let Rachel comment.
Yeah, you'd have to activate a version of your account structure that allows blank. What might make more sense in this case to load those historical transactions is to actually make a second account structure that allows all those combinations. Because it's obviously a lot of work to set those up and test it and validate it. And so the only thing that you're switching is which account structure is specified on the ledger. So switch your ledger form to whatever. Make sure all of your current periods are stopped so no one can post entries and all the old periods are open. And then upload those historical transactions, run your trial balance, make sure everything's good to go. And then put those old periods back on hold and go back into the ledger form and switch it to the original account structure. So because I think you had a follow on to say there's a lot of advanced rules involved too. Yeah, hopefully that helps. I would just make a whole new account structure that is much more simple and doesn't, if all it is a main account and you don't want to load the dimensions, just make another account structure, for historical, name it appropriately so you know that's what it's for, switch the ledger to that account structure, do your postings, and then switch it back to the original one. Looks like we had a comment here. Advanced rule structure is not considered in budget control, so we're forced to use the account structure, which overrides the purpose. That is the purpose of the budget planning rules. So if you're not familiar with the budget planning rules, that's what you want to use. But you're correct, advanced rules are not considered in budget control. That's where you want to use the budget planning rules. I didn't do a demonstration of it. We'll likely cover it in a future session, but hopefully that answers the question, at least at a high level, 1,000-foot view. So in addition, multiple account structure is also not possible to map for budget control. Again, in my experience, you shouldn't need multiple. If you use those budget planning rules to add those additional dimensions, you should be good to go. If you don't want to do a budget check on like your balance sheet accounts, for example, don't include main account, and then you have to go down to the main account tab and mark the check boxes for which main accounts you do want to perform that budget check on. But I think, Ray, I need to understand your scenario a little bit more, but I think you should be able to achieve that by using budget planning rules. And depending on your situation, you might want to exclude main account and then use the main account tab to mark all of the check boxes for your main accounts. So this is not a question, just a comment about the use of legal entity as a financial dimension. So it says, my current client is using the legal entity dimension to identify the sister company for intercompany transactions instead of creating multiple main accounts for each trading relationship. They have 130 legal entities and growing, and they did not want to expand their chart of accounts. Again, you don't need to make 130 main accounts. You can make just one. I see where, like, if you're just putting that dimension in that particular account, you would still have to make 130 relationships, but you can have a single set of due from and due to main accounts if you're using a global chart. You don't need to separate that out. And again, right, the transactions that are getting posted are tagged to each legal entity. So, I mean, I don't technically think that this would even be needed to achieve what you need from a reporting standpoint. You might just need to kind of look at how you report slightly differently. If you want to be able to report from a single legal entity, what it is, like, obviously you would need a dimension. If you consolidate and you pull that all together in a consolidation, you would be able to see what those legal entities are, or if you do a cross-company report, you'd be able to see what they are company by company. That looks like all of the questions that we had in the queue. Thank you, everyone, for all of your engagement and really great questions. We'll definitely take some of the feedback that we got and try to work on incorporating that out into docs and trying to get some better documentation and articles out there. But I will hand it back over to Erin, who's going to talk about our survey. Do use it as an opportunity to tell us what else you want to hear, what you liked, what you didn't like. We do review the feedback and we appreciate it. So, Erin, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. Yes, everything that you just mentioned, I did post a link to the survey in the Q&A panel. It only will take a few minutes to fill out, if that. So we appreciate your feedback once again. And of course, it does help us decide what events to plan in the future. As a reminder, the recording for today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within about 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Rachel and Eric today, and of course to our audience for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful day wherever you may be.